Hello, and welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. I'm Peter Csillag, and today we are talking about Alberta's new pipeline leadership initiative, what it means for workers, indigenous partnerships, and Canada's economic future. Joining me today is Darrel, the Vice President of Public Affairs at PCA. Darrel has been closely involved in advocating for open competition, progressive labor models, and the conditions needed for Canada to successfully deliver nation-building projects like pipelines. Darrel, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's a delight to be here. This is a kind of a new initiative for us in the Public Affairs Department, and we're just delighted to be able to share some of our knowledge with you. So let's get underway.
Yeah, absolutely. So Alberta has just announced that it will act as a project proponent for a new West Coast pipeline initiative with $14 million to kickstart regulatory work. And they're expecting a submission to the new Federal Major Projects Office in the spring of 2026. Darrel, why is this move significant?
Well, Peter, this is the first time a province is actually stepping forward as a project proponent. Alberta is putting real money, about $14 million, into the regulatory prep process, but it also sends a serious signal to others in the industry and other governments. It demonstrates provincial leadership to get resources to market after years of stalled projects. And I guess in a word, Alberta stepping up as a project proponent is a bold move. Shows that we're serious about getting Canada's resources to market.
So based on that, how does Alberta's leadership role change the dynamic compared to past projects like Northern Gateway, which of course was politically blocked by the Trudeau Liberal government, or Trans Mountain, which got built, but only after the private sector walked away?
As you've mentioned, Peter, Northern Gateway collapsed partly, maybe even mostly, because governments were not aligned and indigenous engagement was not central to the project. And Alberta's trying to avoid these mistakes early. That means early indigenous engagement coordinated with industry. And filing the Major Projects Office shows Alberta is leaning into Ottawa's promise of faster proposals. In a nutshell, this initiative is about more than Alberta. It's about whether Canada can still build nation-building projects or not.
So speaking of nation-building projects, shortly after Premier Smith's announcement, BC Premier David Eby came out very quickly in opposition to this Alberta initiative. I thought that was curious because when the BC NDP government challenged TMX previously, asserting a power to regulate the pipeline, both the BC Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada just unanimously struck their claim down. Premier Eby, of course, was the Attorney General at that time. So just given that background, what would you see as the key opportunities and challenges at this early stage right after Alberta's announcement?
Well, first of all, there is immense opportunity right now. There's huge global demand. We have global potential customers who have been very clear to us that they'll take all of the energy that we can get. This energy is removed ethically from the ground as opposed to maybe some of our competitors. So Asia is taking a very close look at this, and this makes the West Coast a strategically important spot. The challenges, there's a couple that you mentioned. The first one is political. Premier Eby seems to be wanting to stake out some position on this. I suspect that that's got to do with politics, provincial politics more than anything. But nonetheless, Premier Eby has to be reminded that interprovincial energy projects are federal jurisdiction. I think that Premier Moe from Saskatchewan put it very well when he said, it's not BC's coastline, it's Canada's coastline. And that's a very good thing. So there is a political challenge. The Feds seem to be kind of playing that down at this point. Hopefully they've got that under control. BC has also got a tanker ban on the West Coast. So right now we could ship lots of energy to the coast, but it cannot be shipped under particularly bitumen and the kind of the heavier oil products. And there's still regulatory hurdles. We still are under Bill C-69, which was known colloquially as the No More Pipelines Act. But the world wants Canada's energy, and I think the real question is whether Canada can deliver. It's going to be a crucial test of our standing in the international community.
Absolutely. And what they're actually able to get built, Canada has seen some enormous cost overruns and delays on some recent projects. TMX grew to $34 billion and Coastal GasLink, I believe, to $14.5 billion. From PCA's perspective, Darrel, what went wrong that drove those costs so much higher?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story of woe, how not to develop energy projects for the world's benefit. The first one is regulatory inconsistency. Pipeline proponents and the people who are building them have huge costs invested in this. And every time somebody changes the regulation or makes it more difficult, that just creates a real problem because companies have to go back and redo. They have to redo all their calculations again, and it takes time, allocation of workers, of resources, and everything. So it's really been a story in how not to build pipelines. We would call them like non-linear construction, right? Builders like to build things from beginning to end and know how that's shaping up. When you inject uncertainty into that process, it's just death for major projects. There's way too many overlapping permits. There was constant start, start construction. Labor supply issues were a challenge from time to time, and that's primarily because of the planning cycle. If you need 1,000 workers or 2,000 workers, you have to plan very carefully for that. And if the project is in flux, it's just going to cost you more. So pipelines are linear projects. When governments force them to be built in a stop-start, non-linear way, costs are going to explode. We have to do better.
I just want to unpack that a bit more. So many contractors do say that the regulatory complexity and inconsistent permitting were the biggest drivers of cost and past cost overruns. How do you think governments should fix that?
Well, the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada has been very clear. Our members want to see particularly one-window, time-bound approvals. It's ridiculous that in the 21st century that regulatory processes can take longer to approve than the pipeline takes to get built. Our members and builders and owners need to know how long this regulatory process is going to take, who's handling it, and when they're going to have their decision. We've also recommended they need clear, consistent, constructible permits. It's not like a half a permit. Once you get to the permit stage, they need to start putting shovels in the ground and get this linear process underway. And they need to avoid subjective requirements. We've had these silly issues about things like frog fences and, erosion rules that can shut down whole projects. Get this done during the regulatory application process and let everybody go. Above all, major projects need predictability. Otherwise, we're inviting delays, cost overruns, and capital flight, which is, a big concern, as you know, of our members and should be a concern of our federal and provincial governments.
During Premier Smith's announcement last week, and you did touch a bit on this earlier, but it was clear that Indigenous engagement would be a key part of Alberta's new initiative. Now, when I think back to the past, Indigenous engagement has often been inconsistent or it's been left to the project proponents with some unclear expectations. How can this process be done better this time around?
Well, and I think this is where the government of Alberta deserves some kudos, because even in the press conference, Minister Sawhney, that was very clear that government needs to set consistent frameworks and templates. There needs to be line item reports for all engagement costs. They have offered a very real possibility of equity shares where First Nations can be involved, local procurement, operational roles that may assist the Indigenous communities in, putting their people forward for training. So Indigenous equity and transparency are the keys to investor confidence. As you know, Peter, Canada is in a bit of a netherworld as far as Indigenous rights go. Canada has signed on to the UN initiative UNDRIP, which remains undefined and still is in our courts today. So having this preliminary confidence of First Nations and making sure we get those issues out on the table first is going to be absolutely key to investor confidence. Governments need to set the framework and not leave contractors guessing. So in Canada, I think we can say that partnerships, particularly on these kind of projects, are only going to succeed when Indigenous voices are central from day one, not an afterthought.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alberta's done a lot of leadership on this. If I think of things like the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation and other initiatives that have started up here in the province over the last 6 years. But over on the workforce side, one of the interesting things we've heard is that up to a third of TMX workers were first-time pipeliners when they worked on that project. What does that say about Canada's labor debt and what's needed to improve it?
Well, Peter, the labor supply people, I'm thinking particularly groups like Buildforce and groups whose job it is to track our labor supply needs, helping companies to plan for this, have been saying this for a long, long time. And that is Canada has a big problem with trades training in particular. They have a big problem with what we call parity of esteem, where, parents would much rather put their children into school to get sociology and political science degrees than encourage them to get into the trades. That's a disservice to many of our young people and our students, because they may or may not wind up working as baristas somewhere at minimum wage. The evidence is out there, and so we just have too many green hands. I should add also that it puts a lot of pressure on our temporary foreign workers process. If we're going to build like the government has said we're going to build, we need to focus on labor training. We have to focus on recruitment of young people. And that's not just a switch that you flick. That needs to be a societal change that's consistent with this. So I would say, too, that all of that 1/3 first-timers issue also adds to costs, right? Because that causes extra supervision, less productivity, and higher turnover. Not everybody's made to be pipeliners, We need sustained project pipelines under Prime Minister Carney, not just one-offs like we have right now. So trades can build experience and can invest more in their workforce. But I got to say, Canada can't build the next pipeline on green hands alone. We need stronger apprenticeship pathways and labor mobility.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Build Force Canada. I think their last forecast shows something like a need for over 300,000 skilled workers in Canada over the next decade, driven partially by retirements, but also just new demand as more projects get underway. Just going back to Alberta's announcement on the new pipeline initiative, from KCA's standpoint, what are the 4 fixes that government needs to deliver so this pipeline can actually succeed, whether that's at the provincial level or at the federal level?
Yes. Well, Premier Smith was very clear on this in her press conference. And frankly, she's been very clear to the government of Canada. She's been very clear whenever she has an opportunity to talk to Mr. Carney. Very pleased with Premier Smith's performance on this. She's been a serious advocate for our industry and for the energy sector in general. So there's really 4 things. First of all is we have to have streamlined one-window approval with constructible guardrails. Really what that boils down to is, our owners and our builders need to know what this project is like from beginning to end. No more fuzziness, no more subjectivity. Give us clarity on that, and our members will build the best pipelines in the world. Secondly, we need standardized indigenous engagement with transparency. Our First Nations friends, that this has been a significant concern of theirs for decades, maybe even over a century, that they're often the last people to know what's going on or what might be going on their land. That's a huge wasted opportunity for the government of Canada and for provincial governments, because they represent, first of all, there's a workforce there. They've told us that they want to be involved. There's equity opportunities for them to improve their lifestyle, and frankly, training and all of that. So it has to be clear. Third, there has to be workforce policies. We have to become construction and skilled trades friendly in this country. We need to loosen apprenticeship ratios. We need to protect and encourage apprenticeships because, as you know, Peter, the big challenge is getting people through the apprenticeship pipeline. The biggest drop-off is after year 1 and 2. And that's primarily because we're not providing the kind of supports that we need. And everybody in industry knows it. So let's find a way to do that. And we also need to support mobility. Canada has workers all over this great country. And there are now currently still, believe it or not, Peter, in 2025, there are still barriers to people moving from one side of the country to the other to do work. And that's just unacceptable. So labor neutrality. We have had situations in this country where people have won major bids on various spreads, like even the Trans Mountain Pipeline I'm thinking of, only to have big chunks of that work arbitrarily reassigned to another labor model for political purposes. That just has got to stop. The literature is clear. The fewer bidders you have and the fewer proponents you have, the higher the costs are going to be and the greater the labor uncertainty. So just to recap, Peter, 4 things: streamline one-window approvals, standardized indigenous engagement, workforce policies that support workers and the construction industry, and labor neutrality. So I got to say, too, that I've discussed these directly with Ministers Jean and Sonny, and they recognize the problem. It looks to me like that they're receptive to this. And again, I'll just go back and say, this is a test of whether Canada works as a country. If we can't build pipelines together, what can we build?
It's a good point. I just want to drill in a bit more to your third and fourth points there. Now, for the last 25 years, ECA has emphasized open competitive procurement and progressive labor models. Perhaps for listeners who are unfamiliar with the progressive labor model or just generally confused about that term, given some of the modern connotations, why is labor flexibility so important on projects of this scale?
I mean, I think it's really fair to say that, most families and communities that are just trying to keep their people at work and their bills paid and all of that sort of thing don't really think a lot about infrastructure until they need it. Of course, in Calgary, we blow up a main water main and, everybody's without water. Then they think about infrastructure, right? But generally speaking, they don't. And infrastructure is highly affected by what we would call labor models. So in Canada, there's basically three different ways that you can get work done. You can get work done by the traditional building trades, of which there are many. You'd know them. People would know them as, the carpenters, the teamsters, the electricians, and they're governed by a very rigid jurisdictional kind of view of the world. One can't disagree that's probably needed at one point, but in 2025. There's no serious argument that has to happen. Costs are higher, productivity is lower. I've often talked about on PCA projects, you will not see carpenters with their heads folded because the laborers have not brought them their lumber. The laborers are sitting there because the teamsters have not brought them their lumber, and nobody can touch any of that. So that's the building trades model. I know I'm waxing on. The other one, of course, you and I would know is the open shop model, and that is non-union shop constitutes, by far the largest proportion of the construction community in Canada. That's where workers make their arrangements with their employers, and many people choose that. The third one, and that's why we're having this podcast, is what we would call the progressive model, which in many ways takes the best elements of both the building trades model and the open shop model. And that is that we do not emphasize artificial barriers. The model that has served us so well is called wall-to-wall construction, and that means that from one end of the project to the other, workers and unions will sign one agreement, not 15, not 18 agreements, so that owners can plan on that. We are very, very heavy on cross-training. Those artificial barriers that are erected by other labor models do not apply. We want our members to gain multiple trades. And in trade terms, that's called more time on the tools. Workers are working more, they're making more money, they're happier, and companies are hiring fewer and better workers. So then, of course, the other issue is what it has applied to many of our major projects, and that's called open managed sites. There's no such thing as people being barred from a project because of the labor model that they choose. Ideally, you'll see building trades, progressive union, and non-union open shop workers all working on the same project. And, for the most part, getting along. We've had a lot of experience in the oil sands about this, and we believe it works, and we believe it's a better way. So from an owner's point of view, this means that this helps the owners and the companies with their scheduling pressures, especially when labor is scarce. We think it's no coincidence that, half of the skilled trades labor force in Wood Buffalo right now is alternative union. We take this as a plan that does good things for the economy and for the country, and it's no surprise why PCA and its membership has grown so remarkably in the last quarter century.
Thanks, Darrel. When I look back over 10 years ago, there were multiple tidewater energy projects that were proposed. There was Northern Gateway, there's the Keystone XL project. Of course, there was TMX and Energy East. And 10 years forward, there's really been nothing like that. Canadian energy companies are still building projects, but regrettably, most of them aren't actually in Canada. So in that regard, Alberta's initiative is really the first promising sign in a long time. Looking ahead, what's at stake for Canada if we fail to seize this window of opportunity for another major pipeline?
Peter, you and I both know, and you and I have both been pretty clear, I think, on what I would consider to be Canada's lost decade. We've had over-government, we've had over-regulation, we have had overt, certainly a covert, but also, I would say, overt hostility to the energy sector in this country, despite the fact that the energy sector contributes a massive amount to Canada's bottom line, which means healthcare and education and all of the things that we value. So if we continue this Trudeau-style gridlock, we'll lose more capital to more agile jurisdictions. It's not like we're the only country in the world and we have the luxury of, having the world come to us. We have to get better on that. Now, I would say, and Premier Smith mentioned this in her announcement, that, there seem to be some early signs under Prime Minister Carney that are more encouraging. Directionally, he's signaling openness to infrastructure renewal and project alignment. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that conversation between Prime Minister Carney and Minister Smith, because she does seem to be quite positive, and she is signaling, hope that we'll be seeing new announcements and movement on this soon. Let's hope so. So this is good. And it's a small start, but it's a good start. And I just want to say, Peter, like PCA and its members are ready. We excel in this work. We built the backbone of TMX. We've built significant portion of the oil sands sector working up in Wood Buffalo, and we can build again. We're eager to do so, but we have to have governments do their part. And I guess I would just remind our listeners, maybe some of whom may be beyond Alberta's borders, that this is not just about Alberta's energy. This is about fulfilling the kinds of things that Prime Minister Carney has been saying, other world leaders have been telling us. It's about Canada's role in the global economy. And so that's why I'm so excited about the announcement. The skeptics will say the proof is in the pudding, and that's absolutely true. Alberta and Canada needs to send a signal to the world that we're back, and we're going to start contributing in a major way to the benefit of Canadians, but to everybody in the world.
Thank you very much, Darrel, for sharing your insights today. For our listeners, again, that was Darrel Reid, the Vice President of Public Affairs at the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. I'm Peter Csillag, and you've been listening to Constructive Thinking, a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.